Pretty often.
Okay, so when I had my opening a couple weeks ago, a lot of people wanted to ask me about my process, and a lot of people wanted to ask me why I have a bunch of fish on my work. And so when I thought of, like I said before, we each have an opportunity to fill this gallery every couple of years. And for me, if I have 18 months, I spend about a half a year figuring out what I want to do. And then I spend a year doing it in my studio. And I really try to have some kind of an idea about what I want to convey, a concept for my work. So my background was in functional pottery, and I made pretty much strictly functional pottery for about 50 years. And then I joined Waterstone Gallery, and they said, we like your functional pottery, but we'd like to see you think about more. So I thought about more, and I started doing other work, and I've always been around water a lot. So when I had my first show here, I started to make fish, but I had always had fish in my work. This is from the early 80s. It's a little stoneware piece, and I was putting fish on them. And then I moved into more colorful work. I no longer had a gas stove, so all my work was electric fired. And so I was doing work like this, and I started to feel like I had a relationship with these fish. And I had, this is because I had a boyfriend at the time, and I was keeping fish, and I had these very persnickety fish. They would only eat live brine shrimp. So I brought live brine shrimp home, put them in the refrigerator, and the boyfriend said, it's me or the fish. And he moved out. So it's kind of indicative that that relationship was not going so well. And I was using foliage, I was using fish, and I started using animals. These are probably from about when I started at Waterstone Gallery a few years ago, and I had built a salt kiln, which gave me the opportunity to have these changes in color and different effects on the clay. This is also from that. It's a slab-built plate. And these pieces, which were more like seashore pieces, they really spoke to me. I grew up on the beach. I love the beach. I love the waterways. So they flowed more. They were somewhat more organic. Then I was going to have this show here. I was like, God, I don't know what I'm going to do. But I happened to go to Japan, and I was in a 2-hour workshop where we were working with local clay, building in a way that was built like 10,000 years ago in Japan. And I thought, well, I always put fish on things. Why don't I make a fish? So I made this fish, and I thought, that's my show. That's what I'm going to do. So this was one of the pieces from that show, and this was what the gallery looked like during that show. And I'm going to mention this piece over here on the edge. It was a piece about a month before the show. We were going to have some musicians in here, and they were going to be creating music that would interface with the words of poems from former Oregon Poets Laureate. And people said to me, well, your work is very Asian oriented. Why don't you do something that honors Lawson Inada, who was a former Oregon Poet Laureate? And I didn't know his work, so I went to Powell's and I found books of his poetry, and it turned out that he had been about 7 years old when World War II broke out, and lived with his family in Fresno, and they were all incarcerated in the concentration camps, and a lot of his poetry is about that and about what that's like for a child. So I looked at his poetry, and there were a few in particular that I thought I could really do something with. And he was 86 years old, and I called him. He did the email. I called him. He lived in Medford, And I asked him how he felt about me doing a piece where there would be a porcelain cup for each of the places where people were detained or kept or deported from. And he was very enthusiastic. I was very happy about that. So that was the genesis of my work that is now being done about ice. My family grew up in an integrated part of Los Angeles, which I didn't realize how unusual that was when we were growing up. When I went into high school, I was one of 3 white children going into that high school. There were about 70% African Americans, about 30% Asians, and a smattering of other people, white or brown or whatever. So we had grown up during the Civil Rights era. We were really, emotionally, that was what we understood. And we went to school with a lot of Japanese kids whose parents had been incarcerated. Some of them had gotten out by enrolling in the Army, which was another terrible experience. And so it was always sort of natural to have a really strong internal commitment to civil rights. So I did this piece. I was very proud of it. And then, about a year ago, I went to a workshop and I learned how to make a head. And I thought, well, this is great because we're all involved in how we interact with our environment. And I've been working with fishes, and my person can have a fish head. So I believe this was the first one I made. And it was small, and I put it in my salt kiln, and I was not satisfied with what came out. I really wanted things to be more definite. But I really was, at that point, very committed to using the notion of how much we in the Northwest interact and believe in the importance of nature and the environment around us. So this was the first piece I completed. And then I just kept going, and the more I did, they got somewhat more complex. They took a lot of time, and I would find myself working on them and thinking, oh God, I don't know what to do next. So I would wrap them up like a little mummy in plastic, and I'd go away and I'd have lunch or I'd sleep overnight. And then I'd come back and unwrap them, and then it was pretty clear what to do next. So that was sort of an interesting process for me. I probably spent like 3 weeks on each one of these, not just building it, but then also doing the coloring and glazing for it. So then I had, a lot of them were showing up in my studio, and I hadn't really figured out how to finish them. I knew I didn't want to put them in the salt kiln, and then last summer I took a trip to Santa Fe, and I happened into a gallery, and there was a lot of highly colored work. So I thought, well, I'm gonna invest in some commercial underglazes, which I had never used before. So I did, and I started making tests. And I ended up with a lot of colors that I could work with, and then I could also mix these colors. And I would make a piece, I would figure out what colors I wanted to use, and then this is the finished piece. So you have to be able to make that leap. And often I would start and I would put colors on it, and I would put it through a first firing, and then it would come out, and then I'd think, oh, it needs something else. So I'd layer another color on top, or I'd layer 2 other colors on top, or I'd do 3 different firings, and each time I would add something to it because I felt like it was still asking for more. This piece, I did a lot of things with this piece. You can see that here these birds are all red. They ended up copper. The wings were very light colored. They ended up dark. And I just kept working and working them until they got to a place that I thought I was satisfied with, and where I felt that they expressed something about the interaction between the human type of, or guardian, or whatever that is there, and the animal or plant. And sometimes there's a combination of animals and plants, that it would actually, that they felt complete. And then this is, this particular piece, these birds are porcelain and they're cast. So it was tricky to get the porcelain and the stoneware. They shrink differently. There's all kinds of problems, but you know, if you can get it to work, it's kind of great. And so these are just, this is a piece that I had fired, but then I wanted more color, so I added more color, more glaze. I refired it, and it came out with the darker pieces. So it's a whole process of how do you know when you're done. This is a piece, with the first glazing, I had some kind of dark green bumps on there. I put them all on, it took me a day and a half. And then it came out of the firing, and I was like, oh, that's a bad color. So I sat down and I repainted every one of those little dots and refired that. This piece, actually, I think I had the most complete vision of how it would look at the end when I started it, and it's partly because it's in many ways quite simple, in other ways it's quite complicated. And this is another piece where I started out with these dots on this bird, and they kind of got absorbed into the color when it came off, and when it had been fired, I was like, that's got to change. So I put something else over that, fired it again, and still wasn't happy. This is somewhere around here. It has a little bit of luster around the outlines of those birds now, and I think that made a huge difference in, yes, that piece, in how they sit on that piece and how they relate. And also, I had done these beaks and I wasn't happy with them, so that has a lower firing glaze on it. So that has, I don't even know how many firings, because it was bisque firings, more bisque firings, glaze firing, lower glaze firing again for the overglazes, and then the luster glazes. So they were all kind of process oriented. They took a long time, but they all made themselves known. This is something about how do you get to the places that people are going to see that you can barely reach. So, you know, I was on the floor reaching up under her skirts, this one, and then I still couldn't get it, so I had to turn it upside down in a bucket so that I could reach down in here and get to the places that I thought would distract if you caught sight of them. And this is fire, well, this had underglaze on it. This is when parts of it that I chose to glaze. And then again, wasn't happy with the dots, so I added the luster on top of those later. Just because I wanted them to be truly complete when they were done. This piece is in the front window and has probably the clearest storyline. There's these little birds that are in a boat because they need to find a new home because their native lands are no longer habitable for them. This here is actually little fish that are guarding the boat as it moves through. These fish are dead, and these birds are trying to help guard those little birds from predators as they try to find a new place to live in this world that's changing so completely all around us. Okay, now we're going to go to the political work, which is also a complicated relationship in this country. I had done the work on the Japanese camps. I had grown up during the Watts riots and during a lot of civil rights era action, and I think this kind of states pretty clearly the time that we live in. If you allow the government to break the law because of an emergency, they will always create an emergency to break the law. So this was the first piece. And then when I was thinking about how I could express my horror at what's going on in this country now, I thought about trying to do something that would name all the places where people are being held. Well, there's like thousands of them right now. You cannot find the names of them. Everything is being obscured. So finally I thought, well, I can name the names of people who have died. And the list does not get shorter, it gets longer. So I was in the middle of putting this show together, and I started doing the research on those names and finding out the more and more about the horrors of what's going on in this country. And I realized I could not do this alone. So I sent out, this was posted down the street. There was these big posters all over the wall. I thought it deserved to be seen again. So this is my studio, and I was able to acquire 4 sets of rubber stamps. I sent out emails to the immediate world saying, I'm gonna have these work parties. If you're interested in coming and working on this protest piece, let me know, and I'll slot you into one of these times. So I had 4 sets of stamps. That meant I could have 4 people in the studio at a time. And I put all the names and all the circumstances and everything into a spreadsheet. And then I cut them all up into little pieces. And this was a workstation. So the workstation, I made all these little pieces of clay. Everybody had the stamps. There was a bowl with all the names. And everybody had a straight edge in case they wanted to use it. And people came in, and it was a very moving experience. People would take a name out of the bowl, and they would look at the name, and a lot of people looked them up. They would do a search online to find out more about that person, and people talked about it, and it was really very moving, the kinds of conversations that took place in the studio as people looked at how many people died of medical neglect. How many were ruled a suicide, but the families don't really think it's a suicide. They want to know what's going on. How many healthy people were taken into custody and died the next day of some medical emergency. I mean, nobody knows what's really going on in these places. Nobody can track them. And there are a lot of people who seem to have disappeared in the system. Their relatives can't find them. Nobody can find them. So we try to make their names known if we can. These were people working in the studio. And we had to really check because sometimes things were not spelled right. That was supposed to say hemorrhage, but it just says mortgage. And this is how they looked when they were put together. So people would give me the slabs and I would make them into a cup. And then I didn't like the color of the clay, so I did some work on how to color the clay, fired it, and then inlaid glaze, and then washed it off, and it would stay where the letters had been impressed. And this was how it worked out. This was a list to work from. And this is the piece that was installed at the ceramic showcase. And there were 50 fewer pieces in that than there are in the current display that's here. And I think this is pretty self-explanatory and still true that ICE has killed more Americans than Iran has. That's everything I have to show you, but I'm open for questions or comments. Yes?
I have 2 questions. One is that the website says these pieces are polychrome stoneware.
What does that mean?
Yes, exactly.
It means there's stoneware that has color on them.
I thought that might be the case, but you know, I'm not a technical, not a potter. And the second question, so you know I'm not a potter, is there any limit to the number of times you can fire a piece?
The short answer is no, but the more complicated answer is that with different kinds of firings, you can be more at risk. The bisque firings, which are lower firings, are really not as complicated. And I could bisque fire these probably 100 times if I wanted to, or don't want to. But I just wanted to get them right. So this clay is also, it's called paper clay, and it has little paper fibers in it. So when you work with it as raw clay, it's very strong. It's almost like concrete. But I always had to make sure that I had a place where with 2 hands I could lift these pieces up, because the attachments could be very fragile. As what we call greenware, before it's fired at all, they were quite strong. But once they were bisque fired and all that paper had burned out, they were incredibly fragile. I was really worried about them every time I touched them. Especially things like with these little roses, things with a lot of little petals, these little flowers. I mean, I spent a day making these flowers and a day and a half putting them on this piece. So everything took a lot of time, and I didn't really want to be breaking it as I went. So once they were, and then I was thinking, oh my God, how am I ever going to move these to the gallery? They're so fragile. But once they were high fired, they firmed up again. They're I mean, I could break them, but it would be a lot more difficult now. There are a few that I had to package very, very carefully. This one I had to protect. This part particularly. This one and the one that has a nest, I traced the base in a piece, about a 1-inch piece of foam, and put them down in there to even begin to box them. So they're tricky, but there's your question about how many firings I can do. Endless. Yeah.
So you did low fire each time you change colors, it made those changes, and then the high fire comes at the end, or?
Mostly that's true. I would keep building up color until I thought I had the right thing. Then I would high fire it, and if it didn't seem right, I would add more color in a low fire glaze, or I would add a low fire overglaze and then refire them. At that point, they're a little more tricky to fire because they're already vitrified and the heat shock can be a problem. But they all made it. I didn't open the kiln and find things completely cracked apart. There was one event where I thought, oh, I really like the way all these colors look over white, so I'm gonna put a white underglaze on them. And I did it when they were dry. I put a couple of them in the kiln, and when they came out, all the pieces I'd attached had lifted off. And I have to assume, because I've never seen it happen before, that it was a combination of all that water getting into the paper and maybe lifting things apart, ungluing things. And I did spend a lot of time putting them back together. But I was able to do it, which sort of surprised me, but they were pieces that were quite complicated and I really liked. So I didn't want to abandon them. Yeah.
Was it the first time you used this kind of clay? Was it the workshop? Did they have learn how to do these?
No, they didn't use that kind of clay at all, but I actually used it to do the fish that I had in my last show because it's very forgiving in terms of you can fold it and you can bend it and it doesn't fall apart. You can use a big piece of it and pick it up and it won't fall apart, which is definitely not my long-term experience with clay. You have to be super careful. And these, I could make, a big piece and wrap it around and create a form this big without worrying about whether it would fall apart.
So are they hollow?
They are hollow, yeah. Yes.
Do you sketch the figures ahead of time, or is it just in your design?
I didn't sketch these ahead of time. I knew, for example, whether it was going to be a fish or a bird or floral, or in the case of that one, carrying a canoe. But I did not sketch them, and they kind of grew as I worked on them, and every time I got to a place where I didn't know what to do, as I said before, I would cover them up and walk away, because I knew there was an answer that, they're very intense. I would get exhausted working on them. Everything took forever. On this one, every one of these little pieces is a separate piece. So everything took a lot of time, and I would get just mentally fried, and I would say, okay, if I can't think about what to do next, it's time to do nothing. And I would cover them up, I would go away. And this clay is amazing. I mean, if it got too dry, I could just wrap it with paper towels, and it would get wet again without falling apart.
Did you start with a head each time?
I started with a head and I started with a body. And I didn't do anything else until I put the head and the body together. And then, it was like, which way is the head gonna turn? Where are they gonna look? What kind of expression do they wanna have? And so for each one, that was a different decision. Yeah.
So, who are these people? Are they associated with some place or
They
some
are
time
us, they
or
are
some
us, but that's an
story?
interesting question. I mean, to me, this is really about how people in the Northwest interact with their environment. But as I worked on them, different people came into the studio. My niece and her husband, who's from Bangalore, came in and said, oh, this is very much like our Indian deities who are part human and part and part animal. And somebody else came in and said, oh, this is very much like what we have in South America, where our images are part human and part animal. And somebody else came in and said, this is very much like what we have in the East Asian, but Pacific, West, down there in the Pacific areas with all those islands. And they're like, oh yeah, we have a lot of animal and human. So in the end, I felt like this is this universal idea about how we really are part of a bigger world, and we really feel a connection to the world we live in. I don't think we take good enough care of it. And originally I thought that would be part of this show, but it was like beyond my capacity to spend, I didn't have the time to push that far. But I think that we all feel this huge identification with where we live and wanting to preserve it and wanting to understand it better. And that's part of the complicated relationship, that we have all of that in our hearts, but we don't necessarily act as though that's so important. Anything else? Yeah.
I love that. I thought it was really beautiful that you contacted the poet laureate and just reintroducing that work then to new audiences.
Thank
That
you.
was really beautiful. So my question was, for these pieces, honoring people that died, do you talk with families, or how does that? how do you approach that?
I don't. I mean, this is a lot of people. This is, and some of these people are unnamed. Many of these people have died under terrible circumstances. I don't even know how you would find these families, and I don't. Somebody was in my studio and said, are you gonna send these to these people? And I said, these people are dead. I cannot send them, and I would not even attempt to package and send each of these out somewhere.
Because I think it would be really beautiful for the families to know that this exists and people are talking about it at other places and on there.
I appreciate that. I don't really know how to do that. I mean, some of these families are in Mexico, some of these families are in Ethiopia, some of these families are in the Ukraine. I mean, these people are from everywhere and have been caught up in this terrible policy that we're doing, that we're carrying out in this country. So for me, the thing I can do is try to make people more aware of how that manifests and how destructive it is. Yeah.
Is the CUP project ongoing?
Yeah, we made 50 more. I mean, I finished this stuff like 10 days before my show was installed, and then I had more work parties, and we did 50 more of them. And there's another, I think it might be 80 that I think I'm gonna do, which are, there are different, these are sort of divided now into subgroups: people that died in ICE detention, people that died after contact with CBP, people that were shot at or harmed during traffic stops and raids, and then people who have died or been badly harmed during protests. So there's a whole new set of people that I'm aware of now that have died in the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, and their bodies are found, and the reason that they are this is happening now is that the easy points of entry have been closed. So now it's only the very difficult points of entry where people can cross, and they're being caught in the summer in 110-degree weather out in the middle of nowhere. Some are found alive, and some are not found alive, and some are not found for months, and their families are all wondering what happened to them. So that's another group that I think deserves to be, most of them are unnamed, And sometimes you only get the GPS coordinates of where they were found. There's not a lot of information, but they still deserve recognition, and it's another piece of this horrible thing. Yeah.
Thank you. There are a couple of observations that I wanted to make, and you don't need to respond, but I thought you would.
Okay.
This breaks my heart. But it also breaks my brain, because I can't conceive of how this can happen. So, in a positive light, I wanted to say thank you very much for pointing out that as you were creating these works, you gave your heart, or excuse me, you gave your brain a break, wrap them up, and let your heart do that non-mental work to find out what the next step was. And I think that too is a complicated relationship between our heart.
Thank you.
Right.
I appreciate that. You know, when I brought these in and started pulling them out of the boxes, I got all choked up. I get choked up every time I work on this project, and it is like a black hole. You get some information, and then there's more information released, but the government isn't gonna say anything more. There's a lot of lists on Wikipedia and The Guardian, and they don't add to the information when it shows up. So you start to do a search on each place and each date and each government agency, and then you find local news that has found more information and has added to it. Some of them that were unnamed in April now have names. Some of the causes of death that were unknown are known. I didn't do new cups for every one of them, but I updated the cards for them because it is endless. Unfortunately, it is endless, and it is very emotionally draining to work on. I think if anybody else has questions, you can talk to me, talk to Anne, but we'll